Unfortunately, trauma shows up in my qualitative research in the interviews that I've conducted with trans individuals. Those interviews often focus on experiences of prejudice, harassment, discrimination. Very frequently, that involves either momentary or sustained trauma that trans individuals face. Transgender individuals as a whole experience disproportionately high levels of violence, discrimination, and harassment. Several of the trans individuals I talked to not only talked about experiences of trauma, but then about having that trauma devalued or ignored by others based on the fact that they're transgender. I think that this really speaks to the need for an intersectional and inclusive approach to trauma-informed care.
I study memory, and I study a particular kind of memory called autobiographical memory, which is memory for the events from your life. And so trauma actually comes up quite a bit in my area. People are very interested in how people remember traumatic events and how memory for traumatic events compares to memory for more sort of mundane, everyday events. And I'd love to tell you that there's a strong consensus in terms of what people think about how people remember traumatic events, but it's actually a wide range of views on this. So there are some people who think that traumatic memories are remembered very, very clearly and in great detail. And in fact, that's why they have the potential to become intrusive, as they sometimes are in PTSD. There's some people who believe the opposite, that when you compare traumatic event or memory for traumatic events with memory for more mundane events, that memory for traumatic events are simply more fragmentary than memory for everyday events. And we still have people who believe that sometimes memory for traumatic events are completely lost to consciousness. They rattle around somewhere in your mind, but below the level of consciousness so that you can no longer access them. As I said, there's a wide range of opinions, and I think people are now trying to tease apart when, memories might be more or less fragmented, when they might be more or less intrusive.
Trauma is one of several kinds of adversities that children and adolescents can face. And it is one of the things that can then affect their sense of self, their capacities to regulate emotions, their perception of others and the world, and their relationships. And so it's the type of variable that I have to think about in potentially leading to impairments that children and adolescents may face, explaining them. Trauma is also something that can lead to a variety of different kinds of psychological disorders manifesting. The most obvious would be post-traumatic stress disorder, but we also see that trauma is linked to increased likelihood of depression, other kinds of anxiety, engagement in conduct disorder or other kinds of antisocial disorders. So, kids acting out when they've experienced these kinds of things. It can also be linked to early signs of borderline personality disorder. So for me, I'd say that trauma is something that can serve as a type of adversity or stressor.
Developmental psychology more broadly certainly has a lot to say about how early traumatic experiences in children's lives can affect long-term outcomes. And we also explore questions of how intergenerational trauma can affect children and their outcomes as adults. In other words, how earlier generations can pass along their susceptibility to certain negative outcomes related to trauma or stressful experiences.